Hello everyone, today we talk about Gnosticism or Gnosticism, depending on how much emphasis you want to give to the or alleged original classical pronunciation. So this very complex thought that is even movement of thought, or whatever you want to call it, that is in fact very difficult even to frame or to give boundaries to, because it's something that goes beyond. It's fundamentally just a set of thoughts that you can apply into different situations, and that today in fact we will see mostly more narrowly centered on Christianity. Naturally we will look at Gnosis alone, but not the importance it had on Christianity is massive, fundamentally. First of all, because Christianity was not born in a vacuum. Especially Christianity as a Judaic sect was particularly influenced by Gnosticism. This is particularly evident from the Gospel of St. John, also from the Apocalypse. There is a lot to tell about this, but in general, Christianity is not born by itself. It definitely owned, as many other religions and those at the time, much to this broader Hellenistic melting pot that was linking constantly, also in terms of thoughts and ideas, the West and the East. So never forgetting that if you want to study Western history, you have necessarily to know something about the Eastern one, because it doesn't make sense to start doing it otherwise. I mean, it's like give it up. And the main importance here is that not just on the influence it had on the genetic moment of Christianity, that is very interesting as a topic, and now we don't have time to deal with in particular detail, but also during, especially the intellectual development of early Christianity, of the early centuries and beyond, because Gnosticism didn't quite die out with the first centuries of Christianity. I mean, after the structuration of Christianity under the light of the sun, with the legalization that came from the Roman Empire, and therefore also the ecumenic councils that condemned positions such as Gnosticism as heresies and so on. But just for instance, think about St. Augustine. There was a Manichaean, originally speaking, and therefore a Gnostic. But also and we've been discussing this on Schwerpunkt more than once, about the importance of movements like Bogomilism or Catharism during the High Middle Ages, that is a witness to the sedimentation of Gnostic beliefs still into this now Christian world. And this is particularly interesting, how Gnostic ideas were fundamentally being developed in part now by within the same Christianity. This is naturally pretty unknown fact. I mean, it's plenty of oceans of inks written about this. Today we will try to very simply, as YouTube means allow to do, naturally, because you can have entire university courses on this, to define a bit Gnosticism and its influences on Christianity. As we were saying before, Gnosticism was actually a pretty widespread idea. And looking at the Near East, or wherever, let's say, eventually the Christianity went to expand in the first centuries, you realize that Gnosticism, Gnostic ideas in general, were actually pretty famous, pretty widespread within, even at the popular level, especially in the Hellenized world, where the typical Greek passion for intellectual disputes was pretty alive, even within the lower strata of the population. And this is a character that will remain also in Eastern Christianity for several centuries, actually, and came to define even much of the policies, the Byzantine policies, and the way the central authority and the Orthodox Church could deal with them, in part, and therefore in a particularly dynamic and effervescent cultural milieu. That was this pretty huge area of it's difficult to give in fact boundaries to the same Hellenistic world, right? But these were all thoughts that were widespread also, they were everywhere, and that actually had come mostly from elsewhere. And they were from a pretty early moment, because let's take, for instance, the same word Gnosis, or Gnosis as we want. It means knowledge, fundamentally. And this was a word that was known in Greek since in the since Pythagorean times, actually, in the old mystic / scientific milieu of Pythagorean tradition. At least Pythagoras of Samos was this prominent Hellenic philosopher from the late from the 6th and the 5th century BC. That and it was a term. This is particularly important because you see that it's a very early date, and you realize that just like in Pythagoreanism and other philosophies that developed later, think also about Epicureanism, Stoicism, etc., you realize that many thoughts that were being developed in the West since a very early age were strikingly, and not by chance, similar to certain concepts that were being developed also in the East, in Central Asia, sometimes even in Eastern Asia, and there was a constant contact even in the classical period between West and East. And objectively, you can't study the roots of Western history if you don't know, in fact, what the relation with the Eastern world actually were. Because, especially at the philosophical level, these were all thoughts that came from areas that originally were way more developed, in terms of civilization, therefore also intellectual thoughts than Europe. Pythagoras lives in a still relatively, not really archaic moment, but Greece is springing out fundamentally. Just so, if you take Egypt or Mesopotamia or India, you see that these were millenary traditions that already existed before, and where these thoughts had been developed. I personally don't have the competencies to show you, where is the Gnosis actually comes from, but it's very interesting. At least at the moment, I could document myself. But what interests now is to see how such concepts were much more primordial than we imagine in philosophical terms, and how sometimes even the same philosophy is kind of the development of concepts that are already were already expressed before, and that eventually came to be refueled or re-injected also through this constant relation that existed, especially in the Hellenistic world, between East and West. The Greek world was pretty much in contact with countries like India, even partly with China. I think that the founder of Zen the Zen thought philosophical thought was actually a Bactrian Greek from Afghanistan. That was, for instance, and the Greco-Bactrian kingdom was effectively a Buddhist kingdom by large. So this tells you how crowded and trafficked, let's say, was the bridge between East and West at this time, and how the boundaries were that we trace ideally today were actually non-existent at the time. But here we would have to lose ourselves into the greatness of Hellenism that is kind of difficult to do in a single video. If you're interested, I made something about that on Hellenism. If you search on YouTube, you see Schwerpunkt Hellenistic world or something like that. There is something that addresses this. However, Gnosis as a word was used since this kind of classical times to indicate the knowledge of the divine reality that belonged to those who had received a initiation. that is a complex of rituals and of teachings through which Wu is being chosen fundamentally and elected by a group to receive a certain secret education comes gradually through the required knowledge. So this is a particularly important dynamic, because fundamentally Gnosis, that in as this broader philosophical attitude, we can say, is known as Gnosticism, as it was called later, taught that the initiatically acquired knowledge was the unique and indispensable condition for salvation. Which means that in line of principle, this is extremely powerful, because in line of principle, the Gnostics therefore devaluated each kind of faith as a form of, as a path, as a different path from the one of knowledge, and fundamentally independent from it. A common misconception about Gnosticism is that this knowledge arrives fundamentally for the active will of the initiated. But this is not really true, because even in Gnosticism, fundamentally it's the same divinity that elects you to that. So you're technically not. It's not just about your will to optimistically and positivistically say, okay, I want to be initiated. You also have to be predisposed in this sense, and this is a way to say, okay, you were meant to go that road. So it was a way to further kind of increase naturally the rightfulness, in some ways, also the power that the initiatic path represented in many ways, because actually these mysteric cults that required initiation, etc., were pretty common out there everywhere. Therefore, that's why Gnosticism is properly a philosophical attitude, because it's not really a religion or a thought on its own. It actually belonged to several beliefs, let's say, better, that could entail different rites, even different deities, because you see that also Gnosticism derived from certain channels, like just think about Manichaeism, that we will see later, but as that came passed through Zoroastrianism, etc. So the mysteric element here is also pretty much important to Gnosticism. So Gnosticism, in a way, underlined, as we've seen, against the concept of faith and of works that are the base of Christianity, the gnosiological element of the search of God. So, as a process of inner enlightenment, it was reserved to these very few initiated. Now, this is particularly important because you realize that even through the Pauline and Augustinian thought, this thing of the few, saved ones that are meant to eventually reach salvation, is something that remains even in in Lutheranism, in the Protestant thought. So these were all concepts that were not really new, that were strongly influenced by the various traditions. That it's not surprising that Luther studied so intensely, St. Augustine, etc. St. Augustine is relatively borderline in many ways. It's very now it's very complex to explain all the implications, but still you have to think of this world of the early centuries of Christianity as an extremely fluid and permeable system, where such thoughts even could have more or less influence on the general thought, not being there actually a common still an overruling structure, ecclesiastical structure that could give an order, that could start to say, okay, we have to preserve orthodoxy and so on. And therefore it's also remarkable how outside of the let's say, the Orthodox Church that eventually split also with the Western one, the Catholic one is schism, but generally from outside of the can say of Europe, but of the West broadly meant, these thoughts actually had remained alive and came to characterize, in part, as we will see also, they had first of all already characterized Judaism, but it would also characterize certain currents of Judaism, certain currents of Islam later. So this was a fluid world that had that even after the contraction of the late antique civilization, preserved some seeds that were to flourish once again towards the High Middle Ages. We have seen it. That's why we mentioned before the Cathars and the Bogomians, because that effectively happened also in the West. So to prove that this that the controls on these ideas was relatively weak. When we think about things like persecutions from one side or another, we don't have to think about the ancient world, about Middle Ages, like as if literally everybody was checked by the local authority, which kind of fate you had. Actually, most of the people's beliefs were completely ignored by the authorities, because as long as they didn't pose any strictly any political problem at that point, nobody really cared. So certain of these thoughts were actually pretty widespread independently since the ancient times in this broader Roman / Hellenistic world, where such beliefs were all kind of blended and mixed, and in part survived. And we often overlook how much even the in this sense late antiquity was a sort of embryo in many ways for parts of, especially from a religious point of view, of the medieval religious medieval thought in this sense, because it's as if this sax of late antiquity in its philosophical dynamism had remained alive in some corners of the Mediterranean and beyond. And once that these centers came to reacquire vitality, etc., they started to re-emanate them, which is particularly interesting. And keeping to talk about Gnosis, naturally, one of the most characteristic elements we'll see better now was the strong dualism between spirit and matter, that is, soul and body, respectively. That can lead to actually very different ethical attitudes, sometimes even opposed one. For instance, asceticism, or the refusal of every moral common law. Certain forms of Gnosticism are in this sense to be found really everywhere, because at that point it's not really about a Gnostic belief or doctrine, but really the way you approach reality and how you see even sometimes your own individual perception of the story. And this can be found forms of Gnosticism aside from Judaism and Islam and Christianity, of course, can be seen in Hinduism or in Buddhism, and especially in primitive Christianity up to the 3rd century. Gnosticism was pretty strong, and you see that during after 4th century, with the 4th century. Several fathers of the church actually fought and polemized against it, including St. Augustine, that had exactly come initially before his conversion to Christianity from that background. And there would be lots of things more to say, even from the strictly geographical dimension. But the important thing to remember here is a bit that these beliefs were widespread a bit as long as everywhere in the Hellenistic world. So it's not surprised that they didn't have actually a geographical location, preferably. Naturally, there were certain regions where these were more widespread, especially when you see that now with the ecumenic councils protected by the Roman authority. Orthodoxy starts to be enforced by the state, so you see that there are certain peripheral areas like in Syria or Palestine or Egypt, partly even Africa, that manifest these problems. But even in those cores of late antique philosophic thought that are exported literally everywhere in Europe, even up to the British Isles, well, you see that the germs, let's say, of such thoughts were pretty much everywhere, because they were very inherent to the when we think about the Christianization of the ancient world. We don't have to think it's something that happened as if, from a day to another everybody became Christian, but especially we often overlooked probably most important thing, and this had been previously, up to some centuries before, a pagan world. So you can't really extirpate a way of seeing, of conceiving reality that has existed since, it depends, not so long as one might think, because polytheism was also something relatively new in terms of ages, especially in the West. Tribalism had reached paganism very recently. I mean, before it was kind of an animistic belief with a very relatively simple religious system. So in fact the concept of polytheism is also pretty much misunderstood, I believe, today, and it's mostly stereotype in a theistic fashion, so that even so-called neo-pagans most of the times don't even understand that what they believe in is fundamentally a theistic derived perspective, and has nothing to do with ancient paganism as it was. But this is just my polemics against neo-pagans that, well, of course some of them are pretty much aware of this. I don't want to criticize them at all, but some popular beliefs that exist today also stand for complete misunderstanding of at a popular level, the mass level, of historical reality, history of religions, and so on. We should talk more about history of religions because it's very important, because it if anything, it shows you how very interestingly how people thought at the time. That is what tricks us a lot, aside from all the other problems we have to interpret history correctly, or at least to something that approaches correctness, is exactly this incapacity of projecting ourselves in the mindset of those people, because they were so far from us. I mean, in many ways much closer than we think. In others, however, very very different. I wouldn't say distant, but simply different because the world was different. But aside from this, what we were saying here is that let's look at when Gnosticism meets with Christianity. It's basically impossible to trace the earliest history. We don't know much about early Christianity in the first place from a strictly historical point of view. But we know, at least we have this evidence, that elements of the mystical and philosophical Gnostical culture spread also in Christian in the Christian environment, starting from the second century Egypt. Second century Egypt, as it's witnessed by the 44 works preserved in the papyrus manuscripts discovered in 1946 in the oasis of Nag Hammadi in High Egypt. So these were some manuscripts that contain, we will see now later more in detail, that contained certain apocryphas of the naturally of the Gospels, etc., and they contain, in fact, this very strongly unmarked Gnostic knowledge that had much in common also with some other doctrines and that existed out there that can be found actually at the same origin of Christianity. Think about the manuscripts of the Dead Sea's scrolls that had a massive influence, especially on the more mystical side of Christianity, with the Gospel of St. John, etc. We will see that. So these are very complex topics. Actually, we will have to address them individually, because talking about them like this, it's too reductive, for sure, at the limits of rarefaction. And we know also that Gnosis, like basically all the philosophical beliefs of the time, had also lots of elements in common with other, of common ground with other, let's say, other aspects, like other disciplines, let's talk like this, like magic broadly meant, or astrology. And let's say that that's why they were so widespread, because it was the common belief that you could fundamentally reach this higher knowledge that would bring fundamentally salvation to you, with the salvific aim of the initiated, that could be that in a way belong to nature. You know, there was a knowledge that you could find interpreting it from observing the world at the time, and things like magics and astrology that were effectively, in fact, demonized by actually by both the official governments, whether they were pagan or Christian at one point, were actually I mean, they were considered science at the time, in part. The only problem is that some of them were conceived to be irrespectful towards the deity. They had some ends, some aims, were considered socially detrimental. Christianity kind of got always tried to get rid of it, but at the same time the same church always kept an eye, a pretty interested eye, on such beliefs, because it was believed, just take Middle Ages, how the clergy actually was pretty much keen on things like astrology. These were actually common beliefs at the time, and that kept living on together with orthodoxy, because essentially those were the knowledge of the time. It's as if, well, drawing parallelisms is kind of bad, but that's what at the time was really believed to be potentially functioning, and the idea of creating precious metals, or interpreting, foretelling the future, or through magics, through alchemy, etc., what was conceived a plausible thing. So there was always a great interest towards this that naturally conflicted with the idea of spiritual purity that didn't have to do with earthly goods, that had concentrated on faith. And in this, it's very interesting, because you see some part of Gnosticism, of, let's say, of differentiation between spirit and matter, that the same Christianity was emphasizing. Be more interested in spiritual matters than material ones, and this was a tension that in this sense was pushing in part even toward Gnosticism and towards certain heresies within the same Christianity that essentially started from these grounds, and that were just brought at the extreme. So actually what is important here to stress is that the Christian experience since the beginning was extremely conflictual. within itself. Just thinking about the differences existing between the urban clergy and monasticism, and these were two movements that were completely different in names, etc. So even within the same Christianity, you can see this struggle to kind of this indecision sometimes, and saying, what is that we really have to follow? I mean, nobody has literally ever followed, Christ's teaching for what it is. Every person has a different reaction, different interpretation, different sensitivity, and this brings to different experiences. So this conflicts left definitely a lot of room for further, for further speculation that very often brought also towards the direction of into those different directions we quoted before. Because from one side you can find the complete most extremist asceticism, with people who literally killed themselves in process. Other thinkers that were instead, in love with this idea of being intellectually superior to others and reaching the knowledge that made them more saints, etc. are beautiful. In the epistles to Corinthians, there is the example deals with this also, if I'm not wrong, because exactly in Greece, in places where mysteric cults, where this gradual elevation to various stages of knowledge was conceived as a normal thing, and Christianity, when adopted, gave rise to the problem, saying, what is this for? Is it really just for the educated? We can make a biblical exegesis, or is it really for everyone? Like, actually, Christianity seems to more consistently suggest, because the Bible is definitely an amazing work, but it has to be studied. It has to be understood. It's not a simple read. I mean, you can be inspired from it, and definitely great part of the Gospels, of the New Testament in general, is definitely aimed at. It was so successful because, in fact, it was relatively easy to understand in the essentials and to inspire, etc. But still, there is a deep and extremely difficult biblical exegesis that the average inhabitant of the Roman Empire in the second and the third, but even in the 4th century AD, and for many centuries to come, even to today actually, doesn't have the intellectual means to understand. But in here, in fact, the debate over faith, the debate even over works, of which can be saved and how. So all the confessional clashes that occurred into Western, into Christian history, etc. But this is another chapter. Let's say that the most important Gnostic influence on Christianity was the one coming from the school of Alexandria. And the most important exponents of this school were the philosophers Basilides, Valentine, and Marcion. So, looking briefly at them, Basilides it was essentially a Syrian Gnostic. He lived in the first half of the 2nd century AD, and his thought flourished between 120 and 140 AD in Alexandria, where perhaps Basilides himself was born, and because the Syrian, even the origin in the Hellenistic world could be extremely mixed. It was an extremely interconnected, dynamic world. People traveled far to study, to get to know. This is a character that was inherited partly also by early Islam in this fully Hellenistic tradition, actually in the same physical places where this was happening in the ancient world. Basilides founded this school. He was the same founder of the Alexandrian school that had as some of the most important exponents of the same. He wrote a gospel on his own, the Gospel according to Basilides, and about which we know very few. Actually, we have some fragment to the comment in 24 books that the same Basilides had added to it. And in spite of the difficulties that this indirect reconstruction of the work of Basilides' thoughts there is clear evidence of Basilides' Gnosticism, especially for what concerns the emanatistic cosmology. Now we will see more in detail what it is in a few. So the main thought of the main core is that, according to Basilides, from a father are emanated 5 hypostases, that is the nous, the logos, the phronesis, Sophia, and dynamis. That these are, and especially the last two, Sophia and dynamis, are originated by other successive emanations in other 364 inferior cycles, and therefore the system was called the system of Abraxas or Mithra. These were words, the letters of the Greek letters of which, if taken as ciphers, give 365. So you see here even this numerological attention for the hidden meanings of words, of numbers, etc. And in soteriology, Christ in this system, let's say, had a soteriology for which Christ was the nous, so the all light. And then in the anthropological dualism, you see man made up of 2 antagonistic parts, fundamentally. This is typical of what we're talking about before, the division between into body and soul, fundamentally. And we know that Basilides' thought was pretty famous all around. Some ferments of Basilidian Gnosis were still alive by the 4th century. And we think that they eventually poured into the indistinct Manichaean Gnosticism that also had its own life. For afterwards, for what concerns Valentinus in Latin, this was another Gnostic thinker of the 2nd century that eventually was considered as heretic, and that we know was present in Rome at the time of Eugenius, Pius, and Anicetus, and we know his doctrines through certain fragments quoted by Clemens Alexandrinus and the witness of other actually anti-Gnostic thinkers, in particular Irenaeus. Valentine wrote his the Gospel of Truth that was discovered in relatively recent times, and it's rather difficult actually to define also here the true beliefs of Valentine, because of course we know very few about these authors, because partly their works went either lost or destroyed, because when these thinkers were considered condemned for heresy, and also because of what his disciples actually made of his work, that actually didn't rephrase it, but they were fundamentally studying it as a system, and not studying the original thought of the original sources that were in this sense couldn't be handed down. So great part of this thinking were in part even they were definitely written, but there was a big deal of oral speculation as well. That is typical of Hellenism. And even though we know that Valentine's let's say also in here we know that the system, however, was pretty similar to the one of Basilides in the essentials. There is this great cosmical soteriological conception for which the pleroma, that we will see afterward what it is, proceeds from a couple of eons that are abyss and silence, and then gets fundamentally shattered by the last eon, Sophia, that is knowledge, and that therefore in this incredible desire of knowing the Father that created them, that is fundamentally cannot be known, it brings to the degradation of the divine element in the world. So it's actually the same. It's the same need to understand that brings the world to be doomed in many ways. So even if these motives are evidently linking Valentine directly with Gnosis, other elements of this system are kind of different. Probably they are probably dating back to certain Judaic sources that have to do also with angelology, the position of Adam and the anthropos that precedes him. So you realize this idea of decay, of denied knowledge at the end of the day, that however still pushes mankind towards that direction, albeit it is doomed exactly because of the need of knowing. So this is particularly important because this is also how Judaism had motivated the original sin. There are other other debates that flourished around Valentine's beliefs, but probably the most important element of the story is that certain disciples of Valentine remained also in Italy, with Heracleon, Ptolemy, Florinus, and some of these also in the East, like Theodotus and Marcus. The other and most important, actually, Gnostic thinker was Marcion. Marcion was born in Sinope, it would be today northern Turkey, in 85 AD, or more or less at least, and died around 160 AD. And he was actually well off, and then he also went to Rome at one point, and already at the time, by exposing his thesis, he was fundamentally excommunicated by the mainstream Christian church, let's call it in this way, simply because his thought was irreconcilable with the one of the New and even the Old Testament, interestingly enough. So here you have a thinker that even goes beyond and starts questioning not just the New Testament in its interpretations, trying to adapt this pre-existing Manichaeistic ideas to applying them to the New Testament, but also kind of rediscussing the whole testamentary system through a different interpretation. And this is particularly fascinating, also because it requires a lot of philosophical skills in order to achieve. And this system, the Marcion system, was so so effective, let's say, so developed that from his preaching was born a new religious movement known as Marcionism, in fact, that had a very vast spread until the 5th century. And what is interesting, there will be a lot to tell about Marcion, actually. Could be interesting. He when he was because Marcion was born of the bishop of his native city, and he was excommunicated by his own father for his religious ideas. And there is all this this munificence that he had for the same Christian community in Rome, to whom he donated 200,000 sesterces, so that's not a few, actually. And now we could go on about him. He for many years, actually, he probably worked at his thesis, then eventually made them known, and that's why, in fact, he was further excommunicated because of the contrast existing between them and the Testament. So Marcion, it's difficult to to frame it, because from one side you may think he basically reinvented a lot of things, but he refused actually every kind of allegorical interpretation of the holy texts of Christianity. He was extremely worried about, exclusively, by the way, about their literal sense. So his work consisted in demonstrating how how the Christian gospel and the Old Testament are opposed, and that when in fact the title of his work was the antithesis. So this the Marcion was reasoning more or less in this way. So while the Old Testament basically tells us the origins of the world, with a series of very cruel and sometimes even evil events that are that reveal the expression of a God that is mercilessly just. The Gospel shows us the Son of God that is good and loving, full of indulgence, and compassion, etc. So, according to Marcion, Jesus Christ, Son of God, cannot be Son of the Old Testament's God, but he would be son of another divine reality, and precisely of the God that the unknown God, actually, that St. Paul had announced from the Agora of Athens. So this spiritual reality that is absolutely good. So Marcion did something astonishing, so that he basically refused the Old Testament together with the law, with the prophets, including the same John Baptist. So at this point, Marcion was, reminding the attitude of Jesus Christ that was against the scribes, the Pharisees, the doctors of the law, because and this was the alleged proof that basically Jesus was going against that law and sending it away. It's by demonstrating the difference between his doctrine and the Judaic one. So, according to Marcion, Jesus represents thus something radically new in history, and the faith preached by him has a value of absolute originality. So this extreme antithesis between the New and the Old Testament reflects the antithesis between the perfectly good God of the spiritual world and the one that instead created the matter, say, the material world. And I remember that just like in Manichaeism, the second God is not an evil reality, but just a sort of demiurge of the physical world. That is, a being which, not being capable of giving perfection to reality, has limited himself to impose laws. So that therefore imposing, for instance, the commandments to the Mosaic Decalogue to mankind, that are fundamentally to be respected, with using otherwise terrible punishments to if someone breaks those rules, those laws. And therefore, opposed to the religiosity of the Old Testament, Jesus' message appears to Marcion as instead the revealing text of the good God. So Jesus Christ suddenly appeared towards the 15th year of Tiberius' rule. According to Marcion, was not born from a woman, was not posed under the Jewish law, but it even didn't have any material body, but just an apparent body, just like the one of the angels, for instance. So Jesus, enunciating the good God, had completely reversed all the values that had been affirmed by the Jewish world, and exaltating in the speech of the mountains the poor, the suffering, the sufferings, the persecuted, promising forgiveness also to the sinners. So for those, he had naturally died on the cross, but he also freed all those that were already in hell, in this sense suffering the punishment of the gods of matter. So the redemption of Christ was valid also for those men who managed to let's say dominate the flesh and their own instincts with a rigorous mortification. So not eating not eating meat, or just also fasting and being perfectly chaste, by the way. So it seems that the same Marcion had collected an organic group of passages from the New Testament that he had kind of epurated as well, by the way, which tells you at that time also how fluid the New Testament still was, even though the actual core seems to have been the canonic Gospels to have been created relatively soon, but there were still this other currents, which Marcion is also one of the exponents, that this collection he called instrumentum, so instrument. And on the basis of his own principle, the this collection had been epurated of every Jewish influence, giving a specific putting a specific emphasis, giving a specific emphasis to the Gospel of Saint Luke and to Saint Paul's letters. So the knowledge that we have of Marcion and of his work is almost completely drawn from the polemical work that Tertullian wrote, the Adversus Marcionem, in these 5 books, and von Arnach was the greatest, one of the greatest scholars that dealt with the Marcionian thought, and that has been, now it's really dated, but there is this general interpretation of the Marcionite thought, according to which the Tertullian basically had a Latin text of a Marcionite New Testament, and that's how he would have allegedly confuted him. But this is very debatable, and also because in part this would have meant that Marcion would have written one of the first Latin Bibles at this point. So it's very difficult to prove, actually. Excuse me if I stop, but I'm just yawning because I slept like for 4 hours in last night, so I'm sorry about that. I hope I'm not more boring than the usual, but probably I am. So these figures are very important because from them you realize the dynamism that existed and even the inventiveness and the originality in modifying, in applying Gnostic attitudes to the entire biblical text. So this was particularly, and naturally also in turn the same vivacity of Christianity had even in putting itself in this kind of successful, let's say, in this position that attracted in part the same thinkers, that was starting to question about its own relation with the Old Testament and the various interpretations that were done of the latter. So excuse me, I changed one thing here. Okay. Regarding this, we have given a certain names. We're talking about the pleroma. This we'll announce how what we will need. Excuse me. We will now see what all these meant. So according to Gnosis, Gnosis was massively influenced, by the way, by the Neoplatonic philosophy, and actually it had drawn heavily from it and its suggestions fundamentally. So, and according to this, which is typically Neoplatonic concept, the cosmos was founded on the strict separation and on the infinite fight fundamentally between spirit and matter. So the fullness of the divine entity was expressed into the so-called pleroma, in fact. So the pleroma means in Greek that the completion fundamentally. So that serves for to fill, to complete. And this is a philosophical word that is used by Gnosticism in order to designate the mediating cosmic sphere, the cosmic sphere mediating, let's say, between absolute reality of the ideal and divine principle and the absolute irreality of matter. So this sphere, in fact, made the completion of this gap separating these two opposite areas of the universe fundamentally, and it counterposed in its own fullness to the emptiness instead of the material sphere that instead was known as Noma instead, that Kenoma, sorry, that was empty and had its own later in the later Platonic cosmology, there was this idea fundamentally of the extensive empty space. So this Eleatic character of not being proper of matter. So the pleroma instead was the fullness, and it was made in itself by this complex of aeons that correspond instead to the into the Neoplatonic emanatism, to the hierarchy, to the descending hierarchy of the ranks of being, let's say, of the states of beings. These aeons are particularly important because, as we've seen, they're emanated by the pleroma, so by the fullness of the spirit. And the aeons actually can mean several things. Like, it's the same term from which the term aevum, or age, in fact, period, come from. According to the ancient Greeks, the aeon was the time in absolute sense that was adored like a divinity in this great mysteric religions of the Hellenistic Roman age. And it was usually even represented like a human figure, basically with a snake wrap around itself, and with a lion's head. But sometimes also as a bearded man with a zodiacal circle on his in his right hand. And especially in the Gnostic and Neoplatonic doctrine, the Aeon, however, came to define this numerous spiritual beings that proceeded by emanation from the Supreme Principle, and they were conceived as mediums, fundamentally, hierarchically disposed mediums, by the way, between the world of light and the world of darkness, or the world of matter, actually. So this is particularly important because you realize that the fullness pertained to the spirit, and as much as the light. Instead, the emptiness pertained to the darkness, but to matter. So in many ways, it's not really confusing, but in this it gives you the emptiness of matter and the fullness of spirit represent this very jarring difference between the value of spirit and the evil of matter. The emptiness meant as a lack of moral values as well of matter. This is important. So this is interesting because you can look at these terms in Greek also from into the Bible. In fact, so the Greek Bible, so the original Bible, sometimes presents the term aeon, especially in the New Testament's eschatology, as the world, or part of the world of the saeculum. And so this is particularly interesting because it's to be found essentially as the same concept into the not really the same concept, but still the same word in its potential semantic shades into the New Testament. So these were all words that were used by the early Christians, but those were started, in fact, who knew how to write, and they were now not basically even Jews, so they had Greek as their common language, or maybe eventually Latin, but initially mostly Greek. And so, however, so we have seen there is the divine entity is expressed in the pleroma, so from which the aeons emanate as spiritual entities. But the problem is at this point that there is a spiritual, an inferior spiritual being, that is the demiurgus, and who has basically modeled matter in a fashion that from eventually the inferior world was created. So the problem of the world that is being created is inferior because the spiritual forces proceeding from the pleroma now got imprisoned into it. They got stuck into it. Imprisoned, literally, it's a very physical concept because this spirit was tied to matter now. So the demiurgus in this context is, that the generally speaking, in the Platonic philosophy, the demiurgus is the god that made the universe. That remains the principle of cosmic order. But in Gnostic philosophy, the demiurgus just orders the world, and this is distinguished from the supreme divinity. So it's just an inferior being as well. It just disposes, doesn't really, create as such. And and then there is man, because in man is instead the in the world, on this inferior world of matter, is the only entity into which there is a spiritual divine spark, divine spiritual spark, sorry, and therefore mankind is the only being on earth that has the capability to come back to the spirit by defeating matter. So you understand all the tension that exists now, and this is typical, in fact, of a monotheism. If you study Plotinus, etc., that's exactly it. And there is this constant tension of the human soul that represents the spirit, naturally, to detach itself from matter. This is typical of, in fact, not just of what we know as Gnosticism in early Christianity, but also of Manichaeism, of Bogomilism, of Catharism. That's the same thing. And what is particularly important to remember is that not even Christianity ever got rid of this at its fullest, because when you look at asceticism, especially its most extreme practices, well, that's something that even the same church has always had difficulties to frame, because one thing is to live a kind of a Christ-like life for, literally killing yourself. Well, at that point it starts becoming kind of debatable in many ways. Another thing is just mediating a little bit thing. So there are two very different and opposed directions that form this more exoteric, let's say this more mystical and more, legalistic attitudes, respectively, that you can find at this point not just in Christianity, but also in Judaism and also in Islam, as we were saying. So these attitudes, these problems remained at the base of the spiritual experiences of theism forever, actually. So according to Gnosticism now, the figure of Jesus is pretty interesting, because Jesus is nothing but a divine eon. Or, according to Basilides, we had developed this concept, he is the nous, that is the divine intelligence. The term nous is also very old in Hellenic philosophy, is in this divine intelligence proper, that is being sent naturally by the pleroma to man, in order to, show him the path of spiritual salvation through the coming back up to the pleroma. And this happens through death, actually, like in Christ. So but what is important to remember in this Gnostic perspective is that life and death of Jesus are purely symbolical data, which means that Jesus is only spirit. It doesn't have a human nature as well. So you understand what this was an extremely challenging thought, because basically in this way you denied the principles of incarnation and of redemption as real history, basically. So these concepts were unacceptable, and that's the same reason why, in fact, even still in the Middle Ages, if you look at Bogomilisms, etc., they didn't use any crucifix. They didn't attribute to the matter of the cross even any form of holiness, and that they despised it because they said that's matter. So that was created eventually. Those were thinking it was literally created by the devil. The original Gnostic thinking was so like the concept of the devil was kind of a non-place more than an actually conflicting fear. So there are different shades into this, for which matter is in fact fullness, while spirit is fullness, while matter is emptiness. So the emptiness is a non-being. So things like heaven and hell have been created only later. The original idea of Christianity was something way more metaphysical. It basically wanted to make of God the only actual existing force, so that evil is not an actual concurrent of God, but fundamentally the lack of God, which is naturally as negative as it can be, but is not in fact the demonization has been made of it. Regarding to this last consideration, however, you have to remember that also that there were other religions out there that actually conceived the universe as a great clash between good and evil. So there were different positions in this sense. From one side, evil like lack of good, or better, let's say evil like, not really evil, but simply either presence or non-presence of good. In others, it was really actually good and evil as two opposite principles that were fighting a struggle against each other. And the Gnosis was spread into the Christian communities, especially through this so-called Manichaeism. That is also a name given to it, which is a syncretic religion based, founded by the Persian prince Mani, that lived between 216 and 277. That was in fact extremely syncretic, because it blended Gnostic and Christian and Zoroastrian elements alike. What is interesting is that Mani was a martyr, so it was so incredibly similar in many ways to the Christian Christian episode, let's say, and it had died during a persecution. It was launched against him by the Mazdaean priests, the Zoroastrian priests, and it was one of those religions that we have just mentioned, that is Mazdaism, in which the principle of there is this principle of cosmic clash that can't ever be extinguished fundamentally between good and evil. In Mazdaism, in fact, good is the spirit, is the light, is the day, is the heat, while the evil is the matter, the darkness, the night, the cold. So you realize there's also very physical world in many ways that corresponds, however, to something greater. Now, this is particularly important because if you look even at the Avesta, etc., you realize that even in Zoroastrianism, there is a kind of this henotheistic concept for which you have one deity, and a couple of other minor ones that are just the emanation of the single one. You have this prophet, if you want. So all elements that were not much just let's say concilable with Christianity in itself, but it's the same. It was part of the same beliefs Christianity had stemmed from, because Christianity, in this sense, drew heavily from all these other cults that had this kind of messianic, eschatological ideas, and this inherent contrasts between good and evil, the persecution of the just, the more mystic character that was opposed to the legalistic one of the priesthoods, etc. So this is particularly important to stress, and and it's always like this. It's always about these two opposite principles: good and evil, spirit and matter, light and darkness, God and his own antagonist. And it's interesting that because the term Manichaeistic is still used today to counterpose in a rigid and dogmatic fashion certain principles of attitudes or positions that are meant to be irreconcilable, as in fact there were these opposite expressions of good and evil, of true and false. And Mani is also a very interesting character. Actually, we can look a bit deeper into it. He was the same founder of the fact of Manichaeism, as it took his name from him. And what is important here is to understand the cultural crossroads that Persia, the 3rd century Persia, actually meant. 3rd century Persia was initially a very tolerant country, then effectively it kind of towards a bit like the Byzantine Empire, tended to sclerotize and to transform its enotheistic views into kind of monotheistic ones. So that's why this is, interestingly enough, the Roman Empire, the Sassanid Empire, also for political reasons, not just religions, had this common, say, religious trend, and the Mani preached all over the Persian Empire and even in Egypt. And there are even certain works of his, certain fragments of his many works that are still preserved. And Mani eventually was killed, in fact, in just like a bit like Jesus, fundamentally, in contrast with the statal power. Now we've seen that Mani lived in the 3rd century, so before I said that Mazdaism, I was talking about not Manichaeism but Mazdaism. I said it. I think it was very clear. But this even Mani in himself is not something new in that culture, because this idea of the persecuted prophet that gets killed is something very ancient, very ancient. It's also in Judaism. It's the same. I think, if I'm not wrong, Elias' prophecy about the suffering just and so on, that has been also seen by Christianity to stress the accomplishment of the Judaic prophecy, and etc. So these are all other, but just to make you understand how deeply intertwined all these beliefs fundamentally were, and how they were also close, generally speaking, and not just geographically, but also culturally, in this broader Hellenistic cauldron, let's say. And that's why, in fact, and it's particularly interesting because Mani was killed by the statal power because his preaching was openly adverse to religion of state, and therefore he was imprisoned and tortured to death. Look at Jesus. So this is particularly important. So in the reverse, naturally, Christianity was at that point influencing heavily also Persia. There were Christians kind of everywhere at this point, and sometimes it's difficult to keep track of them, but we know that in fact there were Christians even in Sassanid Empire was some time that were also tolerated. What is interesting is that Mani also belonged to the Iranian elite, from an extremely noble family, and he was acquainted to this kind of rigoristic tensions by his father, that was a follower of a sect, and what is interesting is that Mani studied in fact Christianity and Buddhism, and therefore collected all these elements. Now, Buddhism is very ancient. I made a video on the origins of Christian monasticism that stresses the influence of Buddhism actually, and on the Christian monastic experiences that also in here were nothing new. There were, monasticism, something existed centuries and centuries before the Christian one, in the Near East and beyond, in Central Asia, etc. But it's from all these various elements that Mani is able to draw, in fact, his own idea. And it's Mani traced his own thought by around 242, when he actually made also he had his journey to India in order to spread his religion, or maybe to escape some persecution. And that's why eventually he got back to against the very, let's say, into the Sassanid capital of Guded Shahpur, where he was initially greeted by the King Shahpur the first, that actually allowed Mani the free preaching of his doctrine. But and that's where he preached very, very intensely throughout all the Persian Empire and also in Egypt. And especially we know that he was committed already at this point to put an end to eventual schism or heresies or misunderstandings that the preaching of his religion was starting to pose in many ways. So after the death of Shahpur I in 273, however, his the king's son Hormizd, he reigned for another year actually, and Mani initially was in contrast with the following king Bahram I, but he continued his missionary activity. It was openly against the Mazdaean cult to this point, and therefore he was imprisoned and tortured and died of sufferances. And there is a great emphasis given in the traditional narratives to this atrocious details that talk about his supplice, and he was kind of scorched alive. Now this is interesting because aside from the obvious physical sufferance, that was also to stress the emptiness of the material world. So also the uselessness of the body, of the flesh, that in this sense was kind of massacred. And there is the reference to Jesus, of course. It also gets whipped, it gets crucified, etc. But it's interesting because in Iran, even later with the Islamic conquest, Shiism actually adopted this once again with the martyrdom of Ali. This kind of same idea of martyrdoms and supplice. So this tells you actually how this torture, this agony, that became a defining character of the Persian spiritual sensitivity and beliefs, and these were things that were much older, in fact, than just the Ali episode and the Shia cult. And this can be traced back to this background, let's say. Talking about Mani's works, he started quite similarly quite similarly to Buddhism, from the awareness of the sufferance of the world. That's where Buddha had started it as well. So this is particularly important. And also of the awareness of the contrast between good and evil in the human person. That is something additional to it, because and from this, Mani conceives the existence as an expression of this perennial clash between the two principles of good, light, spirit, God in the proper sense of the word, in contrast with evil, darkness, matter, the demoniac spirit, Satan, basically. And according to Mani, before the sensible world was created, there were these two principles of light and darkness that had always kind of been there. So they were increated, they were considered co-eternal. So at the end of the day, this concept basically there had not been a real origin. At least the emphasis was not given on a linear view, but more obviously there was a before and an after, but just like more like the Eastern philosophies, there was a much more cyclical picture, a cyclical and ever a reviving idea of contrast, unlike Christianity, that instead stresses much more the linear point. Also Judaism. The creation of the physical world in the first human couple is seen as a result of the clash between these two powers, because mankind, as all the living beings, is formed by two particles of light that are prisoners in the body that is created by in turn by the darkness. So in order to reawake man from the conscience of the conscience of the particles of light that are enclosed in him, the celestial forces have to send a power that is of which the historical Jesus is a manifestation fundamentally, and that has to awake this desire for the salvation. So So this is particularly important because Jesus is part of the equation, even for Mani. And we have the titles of some Mani's works. We have other numerous fragments that tend to augment ever more with new discoveries, and some of them are still not edited. And there is the Shah Puragan, written for the King Shapur I. So the living Evangelion, let's say, that is accompanied also by some illuminations, the Treasure of Life, the Pragmateia, and there is also the Epistola Fundamenti, against which St. Augustine had been a Manichaean, actually is polemizing against. The Book of the Mysteries, the Book of the Giants, and the Letters. And aside from the first work that is written in Persian, all the others were written in Syriac and in Eastern Aramaic. So you understand how these two areas of the Near East, like Syria and Palestine, were close to this Persian dimension as well, and how they were, could be even their languages could even be used in order to translate, those from a Persian thinker. There are also there are some apocrypha like Ikephalia that were written in Coptic, and they're not authentical, as we've said. They were discovered in Egypt in 1935 with other Manichaean texts. So if you look at these broad principles of good and evil, spirit and matter, light and darkness, etc., also day and night, heat and cold, etc., you recognize naturally many ideals that even in the Roman Empire were used at a certain point as a sort of religion of state. Think about the religion of Julianus, emperor, known as the apostate by the Christians, because he basically had tried to restore. To get rid of Christianity at that point when he had been already accepted as a legal cult in the Roman Empire, and trying to reinstate paganism. Well, that was not the ancient Roman paganism. It was this kind of henotheism that was typically Neoplatonic. It was stressing the same idea, the solar deity that represented the spirit, the heat, the day, the good, the light. Okay. And this is what, therefore, it was so it happened, it was present everywhere at this point. It was present in Europe, it was present in the Near East, it was present in the Middle East, and far beyond. So just think of how common all these thoughts actually were, and how this came to influence each other, all the civilizations that participated to this. That's why these principles are so important, and by the way, that's the only knowing them is the only way also to understand Christianity and how Christianity was defined. Christianity eventually emerged as mostly legalistic concept, because at the end of the day, Christianity was favored and enforced by an empire that by definition is legalistic. So they didn't need this kind of spiritual mystic experiences. And even the medieval powers like Byzantines or the papas in France crushed things like Bogomilism and Qadarism, at the same that Islam did. The Abbasid Caliphate was rigidly Sunni. Even in the beginning, they kind of flirted with the Shia as well, but eventually the Abbasids represented the legalistic side of the story, not the exoteric one of the Shia sects and all this stuff, because there was a different view of the world, a world that at that point, according to Orthodoxy, had to be regulated, to be something that had to be effectively recognizable through certain civil structures that were mostly legalistically based. And that's, in a nutshell, how you can interpret even the difference between the clergy and the monks. because these were two very different experiences. The clergy was more, kind of administratively based. It was more mundane in many ways, but it had to cope, in fact, with a reality. It was very complicated. Monasticism was normally more traditionalist, but at the same time it also had this kind of more ascetic origins in practices that continued, that were looked a bit unfavorably on by the church that was ruling from the metropolis, the metropolitic seats, etc. So there's always this contrast in this broad, and you have to understand the broad picture at this point, because it's not about Manichaeism or the just that weird belief that existed in the East that was different from what other things were, with other thoughts that existed in the West. No, because the tensions in these, in the various the various options that exist in interreligions are kind of similar objectively, to which absolute you want to tend. Even rationalism, think about how much, in this sense, even the same Christian orthodoxy was influenced, especially in the West, by St. Augustine. That was markedly less legalistic and more kind of spiritual than other fathers of the church. Think about the rationalism that instead kicks in 13th century Europe, that in 13th century Europe with the official integration of Aristotle into the Christian doctrine, into the Christian, and so these are things that matter, because you realize that they're going parallel with different needs of society. A society that is so varied, so fluid, so even left on its own sometimes, like the Hellenistic one was, autonomistically speaking, brings to this kind of freedoms. Also, if you let things go, these things happen. Extremism takes place. Instead, when there is an empire or a power state that starts to create a bit of order, something solid, this kind of more legalistic need for orthodoxy and from a kind of a single thought direction actually originates, because it's pragmatic. It's not. This is what is often misunderstood when understanding even how processes like Christianization, the adoption of the Christian religion as a religion of state by the empire, etc., is that they correspond to very strict political projects that. To which religion is just a tool, which is modeled according to the various needs. So this, kind of emotionalistic interpretations of the history of religion are that stress only the ideology, the violence, if you want, just the emotional side of the story, are in turn kind of just an emotional trail. They don't take into consideration the structures, the thoughts, the needs, the necessities, and you can't understand the history of the ancient world, of the medieval world, if you just think that religion is something weird that is created by people, by evil people to rule over others because they're stupid. It's not like it works. You can't convince masses of something that, especially in those times. During totalitarian regimes you could. But just remember that totalitarian regimes were also instated sometimes by the same people, by democratic rule. So even the Christianization of the empire, especially at those times when definitely they didn't have the coercive means of 20th century totalitarian regimes, it's something much wider, something much deeper. And the Roman Empire especially was a kind of a light state, like all the states of the time. In spite of its waning towards the later phase in administrative structures, etc., its centralized direction, it was still, something that lived passively all this, that even towards Christianity had to pose itself in ways that couldn't cope much with I'm not saying that Christianity had necessarily to rise to the top. I don't like deterministic things, but I think that if it did, there was at least a broader reason for which this was going on. So all these principles that we have enucleated, these oppositive principles that characterize Gnosticism, were in fact transcribed into those Neoplatonic terms that were pretty old, of Gnostic philosophy, and were adapted a lot, especially in the explanation of certain passages of the Gospel of St. John. If you look, the hymn to Logos is the most evident thing to this, the reference to the light, to the darkness, to in this sense of the clash even against the light and the darkness, and in this sense that the light is still not yet has not been defeated by the darkness. So this idea of continuity of the struggle, that is particularly important. Even some passages of the Apocalypse, of course, have been interpreted in this way. As we were saying, St. Augustine told his story in his Confessiones, in his Confessions, has about how when he was young he was actually fascinated by Manichaean doctrine, and it's progressively that the Christian churches, through the discussions, through the various so-called fathers of the church and the ecumenic councils, very progressively declared Gnosticism, the Gnostic thesis, as heresies. This is important because Gnostic theories were pretty much known to every Christian in a way or in another at that point. It was no mystery. Most of what the ancient paganism also had been about was fundamentally about this. Just think about the Mithraistic beliefs that were also deeply rooted into Zoroastrianism. Actually, Mithra was a Dioscorus of the ancient Vedic, hence Indo-European religion, that was transmutated. So a lot of hybrid, a lot of syncretism, but also in there you find the mysterious cult, and these were things very ancient. Like the Romans had forbidden the Saturnalia back in the 3rd century, if I'm not wrong, in 3rd century BC, and these were kind of this Dionysiac cults that had to do in part also with this. Well, those were actually a bit different. These were more developed philosophical thoughts, but there were still lots of things in common, also in terms of this dichotomy between light and darkness, etc. And therefore the essentials of a dualistic view of the world was pretty attractive, even philosophically speaking, because it was that simple. I mean, it was something that was backed even by all the other scientific or pseudo-scientific views of the world that existed at the time. I mean, we live, for instance, in a world where things like even light is often artificial. You have to think those people lived in a world where, where when there was light or where it was dark, all life changed. So this sharp contrast was much more evident. Life was also pretty miserable, so the idea of even seeing a person dying and rotting was, so striking. It was just thinking how the mortality of those times, how it affected people, and how they needed to think there was a spirituality, there was a soul that could go away, that could escape from that world. That's what Gnosis says. It was very powerful and emotional, if you want. The idea that we are all trapped souls that that don't need to be here stuck into matter, but need to come back from where we really belong. There is also a very strong celestial, universalistic ideal, sometimes even a relatively pantheistic one, because even emanatism starts from this assumption that we all in fact are emanated from this original principle. And it's not, after all, so strange to think about this, because we all effectively come from the skies in a way or in another, and this were thoughts that even in the primitive thinking of those times were actually known, were actually understood. So the world is after all the same old mystery. Not much has changed, and so it's very progressively that Gnosticism is at least concealed, is refused. Just remember that heresy, etymologically speaking, means choice. So these were opinions, fundamentally wrong opinions, were sustained with obstinacy, and that naturally at that point were condemned also for broader political issues, not just religious ones, because they effectively were now intertwined with the local autonomistic pushes in the empire. It's not a surprise that a center like Alexandria, from which we have seen Basilides founded the most influential Gnostic school, was in this sense the seat of things like monophysism in terms of heresies, and wanted to be separated from Constantinople, that instead pushed for orthodoxy and the true nature of the divine and human natures of Christ. So, or Arianism. So, what is particularly important in here is to understand the reasons that are mixed. They're political, they're social, they're cultural. They get mixed up, and they can explain only in this fashion. And I would say that the Gnostic beliefs were never quite abandoned, because it was not a matter of reading, I don't know, Marcion or others. It was just thinking that the world could really be intelligible through this arcane, occult, mysterious knowledge that could be reached only by an elected person. And who was the elected person? But it was obviously the elite, who could read, who could study books, who could understand things, study, reality, matter, etc. This was a world where people thought that, you could effectively, by knowing alchemy and astrology and magics and all this stuff, you could basically put together the forces of the world in some ways that could be of use for you. So the idea that you could own these special powers through knowledge, etc., reinforced the Gnostic attitude. It never abandoned the concept of faith, the concept of works as well, but it also said, there might be this plus that helps me reaching those, and that is actually effective, because if God has, by the way, given me this world, it's also for me to look into it. So this is also why, for instance, the medieval world was an extremely curious one in many ways. It really asked itself many times what was reality about, and knowing reality was dangerous sometimes, because there were the traditionalists who said, okay, all you have to do is to read the Bible, and that's it. And you don't have to study anything else. Instead, what you see is that effectively the Christian Middle Ages evolved through the continuity with the, let's say, profane knowledge that existed since the ancient world. There's never been a single moment in Christian society where Christian society abandoned classical knowledge, the knowledge of the pagans, also because they were, aside from the fact that, of course, those were the source of science, etc., but they were effectively the base over which the same Christian skills had been formed, and they were useful. So even the idea that the world is just a great symbol that needs to be deciphered was never abandoned, but at the same time it always posed this problem. Are there kind of other ways to reach salvation, to achieve salvation, without passing through just these apparently even vague and strange ways, like that are difficult to achieve, and they're pretty they're not fact checkable, more or less. Think like repenting. What does repenting actually mean? It was easier to say, okay, let's see if through my knowledge I can better understand the spirit. It's an intellectualistic approach that has always existed, will always exist. There will always be someone in the world who will think that the world will be saved by reading and not remain a brute and an ignorant. And I think it's actually a very beautiful thought, but at the same time, and I think Christianity is very right, there is that extra more that you can't reach. That all stems from the original sin, and even the boundaries that you are created are still created by God. And therefore, you can push your knowledge, which is even positive, because science, in this sense, came to define, in fact, divine nature. This is even in the ecclesiastical right. It was like that, fundamentally. That scientific evidence is what dictates, even the human right, because it's what God created for the humans. So it's also funny today to see how science and religion are kind of brought kind of something one opposite to another, while even in theistic perspective this is absolutely false. And obviously the scriptures have to be studied and interpreted, not strictly metaphorically, but in ways that naturally have to be interpreted in some way. It's from this exegesis and this understanding. People say, well, but you need to study, you need to reach that awareness. Because after all, the Bible is the Bible. It's the book per excellence. That's what Biblios, that's what it means in Greek, and that's why it's called like that. So even though Jesus preached, well, people wrote it down, and the Bible came to be, in fact, our only mean at this point to understand what the message of Judeo-Christianity de facto is. And you can see that even with Islam, with the Quran, etc. And it's pretty evident in many other religions. So it's important because it's a struggle that can never be fully solved, and there are more subtle philosophical considerations you could do that by saying that fundamentally. Both things should be done at once, that you can't stop. You should always kind of do your best in some way. Now, defining what is the best, it's pretty complicated, but the just naturalism fundamentally tells us that you can understand, you have this interior tension within yourself that pushes you to that. And that's why Neoplatonism, aside from Gnosticism in itself, it was so much, was what was adopted by Christianity. Like, think about Saint Augustine, but any other, the effectively Christianity is Neoplatonic until Thomas Aquinas. That's it. That was the main. It stemmed from Saint Augustine. That's it, and it remained as one of the major veins, in fact, of Christian thinking. And in fact, Plato and Aristotle had defined already this, not really diametrically opposed conception, but this intersectional, I would say, perception, for which, for Plato, it's a matter of saying, going from up and from down to up, going up and down. From Aristotle is saying, let's go. It's about going left or right, and you can intersect these two thinkings, without shifting through this, without having necessarily to choose one of these two axes, because these two axes have the point in common, that is in the middle ground fundamentally. And they both have excesses at the extremities of this axis. So Christianity did nothing, even if in different times and with different modalities, to acquire this thinking and to formulate it. And this is what Judaism did in the same way. This is what Islam did in the same way. If you look at their thinkings, their philosophy, that is exactly the same paths, and they're very interesting to confrontate with Christianity, because you realize that they have, first of all, a lot in common. I mean, they were studying literally from the same authors, and there is not think about Avicenna, think about Maimonides, and those go together with Thomas Aquinas. It's important to stress this parallelism, because the more distinctions you make, in my opinion, the more you lose part of the whole picture. That is kind of the most important one. So this could open up several considerations also about the differences between the Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, etc., that go beyond the strictly fideistic aspect and have to do the way they approach reality, which is something that, by the way, now we have lost. What is dramatic, I think, is that we have entered into a phase of history in which we are coming back to the emotional approach and not to the rational one. You can see it in basically possibly every faith now. Nobody is actually in every religion. I mean, nobody's actually interested in defining the world, but just in expressing feelings, which happens even outside religion, which is deeply disturbing. And this is another proof that in fact, religion in this sense, and religion expression, let's say, better follows these historical phases that are have a motive for existing in this way. So these are all very important thoughts, in my opinion, because they're not just talking about the past. They're observing that certain problems that we have were already studied by others, and now we have forgotten what these others have got to, and we refuse them, saying, those are old, and very often with the excuse that they are religious. Like, let's assume that you're an atheist, and you say, well, this is just because it's been written by a Christian or by a theist in general, it's garbage. You don't have to read it. How can you reason like that? How can you live in the Western world and not knowing at least the Judeo-Christian philosophical systems? It's impossible. If you want to study Western history without knowing anything about Judeo-Christianity, well, you're going to have serious problems with that. Because they also help to give, aside from naturally the constitutive part, of course, but they also offer a kind of narrative in which you can interpret history. Because of what we just said before, that is that those problems came out to effectively, find solutions to a society that had those particular problems at the time. So they also show you what society heading for at that point, and it's excruciatingly important. So studying the Bible is pretty useful. I believe there is a great coming back of biblical studies, because they effectively reveal a lot about our own world that we in our secularization we have basically thrown away unjustifiably. Because at that point it's not about what faith you own, it's whether you own one, but it's effectively about what that book, historically speaking, can tell. Not just the Bible itself, the Bible naturally as a as a base naturally, but even studying all the philosophical thought in the last 2,000 years, well, you can't avoid that, because otherwise you don't know what you're talking about in every single century of our history now, of our last 2,000 years. So it's particularly important. And there were some Gnostic theses that had a kind of a further life. For instance, there was Sabellius modalism. It actually stems to from in the 3rd century. Sabellius modalism stated that the components of the Divine Trinity are not actual persons, but certain transitioning modes of divine expression. Then there was Gnosticism that denied real material reality, and even in the sufferance and death of Jesus on the cross, but thought they said that these were just apparent, and from which it's actually its name, Gnosticism, which comes from the Greek dokein, which means to seem, to look like. So this had a great a further life, and if you look at all medieval heresies, basically you realize that they all play on this ground. They all play on the on this freedom of this radicalism that the dichotomy, the strict Manichaean dichotomy proposes fundamentally. Because Manichaeism added to Gnosticism the evil of the of the matter. So in a Christian dominated world, like great part of the Middle Ages was, where this was simply applied to Christianity, and therefore it was shown that matter was evil, and therefore there were these excesses, like even the Eucharist is not the Eucharist is not, it's not valid, because it's based in fact on matter, on flesh and blood. So it's terrible from this perspective, because those are matter and therefore are evil, just like the cross. That's why, in fact, the Byzantines basically launched the only crusades in their history in order to slaughter the Bogomils that were preaching actively these things. Now, even there, the story is complicated, but that's essentially it. And in Western Europe, I mean, this has been absorbed by the church, even historiographically speaking. People today, I don't think they give so much importance to it, but by the 12th century, heresy, this kind of heresy was spreading literally everywhere. And eventually the church managed to absorb it. They were kind of... the church medieval church was extremely clever. The papacy did things that objectively were amazing. In a way, it managed to stem these initiatives and to absorb them. People say, well, it was just about brutal repression. No, they didn't have the means to achieve brutal repression. You couldn't stop a system like that with brutal repression. It would have made it even just worse. You could repress here and there the heretic if you had the connivance of the local authorities and all this stuff, but the problem was much more widespread, especially when the same local communities were actually ruled by people who believed these things. So there had to be very different solutions. The solution, the most clever solution, was actually the Mendicant orders that naturally had a terrific impact in absorbing these tendencies. Now, the main result, however, was achieved is to stem this. But there was a moment in which legitimately these heresies could take over, and it was perfectly realistic. And this is a chapter that is completely ignored usually, or at least the heresies are treated like just, you know, the pure free thinker that stemmed out of a kind of a secular thinking. I mean that stood out from a religious, from a theistic world, and saying, okay, well, I want to think differently, and got slaughtered. Well, this is not really how the story was, chiefly because these heretics were all fully Christian, and they were even more radical Christians than we believe. Secondly, the way these movements could be absorbed were actually different. Most of these movements were not even actually against the Roman Church. On the contrary, they thought that the Roman Church was the only true authority that could protect them, could defend them. So they didn't recognize papal authority most of the times. So it's plenty of misconceptions that still have to be, you know, not revealed. We're not Gnostics in this sense. You don't have to participate. Schwerpunkt is not a secret, mysterious cult that we need to explain these things. But it's amazing, I believe, how in the pop culture this is still kind of, you know, what is this guy talking about? You know, no, whatever. So for now, there would be lots of things to say, but for now, I stop it here. And we will definitely come back on this topic sooner or later. It's mandatory because this is one of the big ones, right? So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.